We should meet. I don't know. I mean, it's getting clearer. The more time is spending, it's getting clearer. So I have to document it.
If that's required growth, I don't know if I'll ever.
I can't help it, right?
That's probably the biggest point of conflict in my fashion.
So
That's the clicker.
that's the clicker. So you gotta kind of aim it up like towards the
Okay.
clicker and it should work okay. Just go forward, go back.
Excellent.
If anything goes wrong, I'll just rush up and fix whatever it is.
All right. Thank you.
I stashed her in my outfit in case you want. Show up.
So you just locked your door and asked me if I had sight.
Yes.
Stuck, but she saw mine.
Oh, yeah.
I didn't get to bring it.
So we just start
Welcome, everyone. Thank you for coming or for being Zoomily present with us. The School of Historical, Philosophical, and Religious Studies and Public History within that school are delighted to have historian Benjamin E. Park with us today. Ben has degrees from Brigham Young University, University of Edinburgh, and Cambridge. And after serving as postdoctoral fellow in history at the Kinder Institute on Constitutional Democracy, he joined the faculty of Sam Houston State, where he teaches undergraduate and graduate courses, clearly helps to run the place, and also writes these terrific books in which he discovers the way Americans have imagined the nation and tried through politics, through force of intellect, spiritual argument, and violence to will those imaginings into existence. So the grace with which both Ben's first book, American Nationalisms, and the book on which today's lecture will be based, Kingdom of Nauvoo, The Rise and Fall of a Religious Empire on the American Frontier, which won the Mormon History Association Book Prize. The grace with which they're written is also evident in his many writings for popular outlets, including the Washington Post, the Dallas Morning News, and the Junto, the latter of which is more important, frankly, to us early Americanists than the Washington Post. And he is a welcome guest on many podcasts and NPR. He serves the profession in just an absurd number of capacities. It wasn't clear to me reading Ben's CV why there was a need for other early Americanists, but he's also a lovely person, so he's looking completely mortified that I just said that. So welcome, Ben has spent the day with undergraduates and graduate students, and we are now so happy to learn from you about this fascinating chapter in American history. So please welcome Ben Park.
Thank you so much, Catherine. You've been such a great host today. It's been so wonderful to meet many of you at various events today, and I'm looking forward to dinner as well. Even before he arrived in Nauvoo, Thomas L Kane, a young, rich, and handsome traveler from Philadelphia, was already impressed by its appearance. I was descending the last hillside upon my journey, he recalled, when a landscape in delightful contrast broke across my view. In front of him, across the Mississippi River, lay a beautiful city glittering in the sunrise. He could see the tidy dwellings and lush gardens on the flats, and above, on a bluff, a noble marble edifice with a towering gold and white spire. Kane noted the unmistakable marks of industry, enterprise, and educated wealth. It struck him as a scene of singular beauty. Yet after procuring a skiff and crossing the river to see the city up close, he was met with silence. He didn't find a soul on the city's streets, and every building he entered was vacant. Kane wandered the empty roads, walked into the abandoned homes, and explored the deserted shops. The town lay as if in a dream, he said, under some deadening spell of loneliness from which I almost feared to wake it. If Kane had only visited a year before, he would have encountered a bustling city of over 15,000 inhabitants, one of the most populous urban settlements west of Cleveland, even larger than Chicago. But by the time he arrived in September of 1846, all he found was a ghost town. He noted, however, that the grass was not overgrown, nor all the footprints washed away. Plainly, it had not slept long, he concluded. And Kane was right. As his inspection continued, he soon found remnants of a large battle. Embers of a just perished flame were all around him. He eventually encountered men from the victorious side, intoxicated militiamen relaxing by the temple and sharing stories of their bravery. When Kane approached them, they leapt to their feet and demanded to know his business. Once assured he was not a Mormon, they offered to give him a tour of the majestic stone structure, though they confessed that it was not theirs. The men boasted that after several years of conflict with the deluded persons who inhabited the city, they had finally evicted the last of the fanatics a few days previous. Kane listened to their rants before departing and making his way back across the Mississippi into the Iowa Territory. It was there that he found the battle's losers. Near the river, he stumbled upon a makeshift camp of over 600 Mormons, either too sick or too poor to move further west. It was a dreadful scene. They were there because they had no homes, nor hospitals, nor poorhouses, nor friends to offer them any aid, Kane recalled. Most of the Mormons had fled Nauvoo before the summer, leaving behind only those who lacked the strength and provisions. Finally, these struggling saints too were forced out at gunpoint. They were now huddled on the west bank of the Mississippi as they waited for their church to send necessary assistance. Meanwhile, from across the river, Kane could still hear the ruffians drunkenly singing and shouting as they danced around the Mormon temple. The city that Thomas Kane encountered that September day is a good metaphor for how Nauvoo is remembered now. The basic outline and structure was still there. In 2 weeks, I'm going to be visiting Nauvoo, where you can still find several reconstructed homes and even the temple rebuilt on the bluff. But the city's life and vibrancy was missing. Little has changed since then. In the 21st century, even among those within the LDS tradition, who are aware of Nauvoo, the city's story is often tamped down, a quixotic, tragic, but ultimately temporary way station on the march to Utah. Outside of the Mormon traditions, Nauvoo is hardly known at all, a ghost town whose specter continues to haunt the grand narratives of America's religious liberty. But more than just a fascinating tale, The rise and fall of Nauvoo demonstrates the paradoxes of American religious liberty and the pitfalls of democratic rule. Histories of the early LDS Church, those both written within and outside the faith, have emphasized that Joseph Smith and his followers, as exemplified by their radical actions in Nauvoo, had diverged from American culture and society. To skeptics, Smith's theocratic bent seemed incongruous in a period supposedly characterized by the expansion of democracy. And his emphasis on priesthood authority appeared to clash with prevailing beliefs in individual freedom. To believers, conversely, Nauvoo was a corrective to the world, God's chosen people set aside from a wicked and fallen population. To both groups then, Mormons and Mormon Nauvoo were a peculiar people and a peculiar place. Yet the period in which Nauvoo took place, what historians call the Jacksonian era, even though rightly known as a period of democratic upheaval, was also a time that provoked immense cultural backlash. To many people, not just the Mormons, American society seemed to be spinning out of control. Early Mormonism's radical solutions were designed to solve problems many contemporaries also perceived. Indeed, their success at winning tens of thousands of converts stemmed from their ability to tap into widespread sentiments about social decay and failure. Rather than an exceptional episode then, Nauvoo embodied many of the contradictions and tensions of its time. Its story reveals not only the radicalism of Joseph Smith and his followers, and there certainly was radicalism, but also the tenuous nature of the American experiment. Examining the rise and fall of Nauvoo's empire demonstrates how Americans still struggled with the concept of and practice of democracy only a few generations after its birth, as well as highlights the legacies and paradoxes of the country's commitment to one of its most cherished ideals, religious liberty. In many ways, we're still trying to grasp its lessons today. When the Saints arrived on Illinois soil in the winter of 1838-39, they were religious refugees. A state-sanctioned mob had forced them out of Missouri, their third coerced evacuation in the church's 10-year history. And most of the Saints were forced to migrate while their leaders were still imprisoned, leaving them feeling helpless and unmoored. Some even wondered if there would be another gathering at all. Wouldn't they be less prone to opposition, many mused, if they followed the more traditional model of assimilation and dispersion among different communities? Yet Joseph Smith, still writing from jail, assured them that there would be yet another gathering, another Mormon Zion. And when they were offered a scenic tract of land along the Mississippi River, they jumped at the opportunity. Displayed here in a surveyor's map in the 1830s, the land on which they settled had already witnessed several transformations. Previously the home to several Native American tribes and known as Quashkima, much of the area was given as payment to War of 1812 veterans, which largely disenfranchised the indigenous communities that lived there. But as with most veterans paid with Western lands, few proved willing to settle in the unknown territory, and most sold their tracts to speculators. The area then went through a series of owners and names, at one point identified as Venus, another as Commerce, a title that reflected its potential as an economic hub in America's growing capitalistic empire. But what remained constant was a struggle to attract settlers. The Mormons, therefore, provided an opportunity for the speculators to unload hundreds of acres of unsold land. To the Saints, the region's undeveloped status was a selling point, as it provided a chance to build a city on their own terms. They divided the new land into 4-acre blocks, each comprised of 4 1-acre lots. Incoming Saints built small homes and developed meager gardens and orchards. Even the town's name did not survive the transition, as Smith soon rechristened it Nauvoo, a Hebrew term for beautiful place, to designate its sacred cause. The town of Commerce, originally designed to be a small economic trading outpost of an expanding national economy, was replaced with Nauvoo, a godly city patterned on biblical precedent. Nauvoo's development diverged from that of other economic spokes on the periphery of America's growing capitalistic wheel. While most Americans praised the social transformation that brought more choice and opportunity, there were other groups, like the Mormons, who worried that America had lost its way. The Saints believed that the nation had forgotten its true purpose and was in need of a return to divine values. Too few people followed the commandments. Too many people were left behind, and too much chaos seemed to reign. Nauvoo was to be an asylum for God's chosen as they escaped a fallen world. Unlike other frontier cities that aimed to expand the nation's ambitions, Nauvoo was meant to serve as its check. Joseph Smith, once he finally escaped Missouri and made it to Illinois, arrived in the state at a very opportune time. Illinois was known for its energetic practice of democracy, and the political realm was filled with enterprising individuals like Abraham Lincoln and Stephen A. Douglas, who aspired for acclaim and success. This typically required support from otherwise marginalized groups because the state was nearly equally split between the two parties at the time, the Whigs and the Democrats, so nearly everyone was anxious to court the votes of their new neighbors, heretical though they may be. What made the issue even more crucial was the fact that Illinois' rapid growth was providing new opportunities. First, the state was granted 3 new congressional seats in 1841, leading to more politicians eager to court the Mormon vote. And second, the state had just passed new legislation that granted suffrage to all adult men who resided in the state for at least 6 months. These new voting laws meant that many of Nauvoo's residents, including the thousands of converts who were arriving every year, would be eligible to vote in the upcoming important elections. In other words, it was time for a political harvest, and the Mormons were low-hanging fruit. Joseph Smith and his fellow saints were anxious to take advantage of this situation. They finally seemed to be in control of their own destiny, as local and state authorities were forced to listen to their plight and respect their interests. Aspiring politicians made Nauvoo a frequent stop on their campaign trips, where they promised the saints consistent support. LDS leaders then leveraged this to their benefit, as when they drafted and passed a city charter that granted Nauvoo immense legal and political power, including a standing legion that, while theoretically part of the state militia, was in practice controlled by the city and Joseph Smith. State authorities tripped over each other with excitement to curry Nauvoo's favor, a move many later came to regret. Once established as a city, or at least in the Mormons' mind, a city-state, the saints continued to flex their political muscle, primarily through the voting box. The most efficient way to assure influence turned out to be through block voting, or the orchestration of all Latter-day Saint votes toward a specified candidate they believe would support their interests. One Nauvoo resident explained it to his non-Mormon father in a letter, where he wrote that while he was never much of a politician, this method of politicking was necessary. We give our votes to the Democrats in some cases and the Whigs in others, so that due to our great numbers, we can gain the influence we need. The Apostle John Taylor, who also served as the newspaper editor, was even more forthright. It can serve no good purpose that half the church should disenfranchise the other half, he reasoned, thus rendering Nauvoo powerless as far as politics are concerned. The Mormons had therefore found their route to political influence, group mobilization through the direction of their prophetic leaders. And here's the remarkable part: politicians listened. Perhaps my favorite example includes the aspiring politician named John Harper, who was eyeing one of the new congressional seats in 1842. The summer before the election, he wrote Smith this letter requesting his private support and assured the prophet that he had never affiliated with any anti-Mormon party, therefore requesting that Joe Smith would announce their support for John Harper. However, the very next day after writing this letter, Harper caught wind of the rumor that he had actually attended an anti-Mormon convention the previous year. Caught red-handed, he dashed off another letter, assuring Smith that yes, he had in fact attended the anti-Mormon convention. but only to urge the attendees to take sympathy on the church and to see that Nauvoo was a blessing for the state. Harper's reasoning was obviously desperate, but it reflected a broader desire for Nauvoo's potentially decisive votes. And not to spoil too much, but John Harper didn't earn the Mormon vote. When Election Day arrived on August 1st, 1842, that first year with the new congressional seats, the Saints voted as promised. By that point, the Democrats, led by a determined Stephen A. Douglas, had succeeded in securing Nauvoo's backing, and Joseph Smith had announced his support for the Democrats at a general conference. Voting in one of Nauvoo's 3 precincts then took place in the office of Hiram Smith, Joseph Smith's brother and the second in command of the church. The building space, which was both the site of civic and ecclesiastical meetings, reflected the overlap in Nauvoo between the 2 realms and allowed me to paint the scene of what voting was like, because it's quite different than how it is today. Eligible voters then walked into the room where they were met by Joseph and Hiram, who, remember, had already said who the Saints should vote for. And then they would vocally declare who they were voting for in the 10 county and statewide elections. Their votes were then tallied in a tally book and then reported to county authorities. Of the 457 people who voted that day in this Nauvoo precinct, only 11 did not follow the prescribed pattern. So you'll see all the ticks in the same boxes. As you might imagine, Illinois residents outside of Nauvoo did not look too kindly on this process. To them, this was the very type of backroom dealing between church and state that they believed what the nation had abolished. Though most Americans at the time did not believe in a separation between religion and politics, and many maintained that it was a Christian nation after all, and they supported a quasi-authoritative Protestant majority, but they've still placed a premium on what they called the personal conscience, or an individual's right to choose. Listening to ecclesiastical leaders for voting cues then disrupted in their minds the democratic balance. One observer claimed that when a body of men acting under the garb of religion shall decide our elections and act together as a body politically, it was time to bid final farewell to our liberties and the common rights of man. Another denounced this clannish principle of voting in mass at the dictation of one man as repugnant to the principles of a republican form of government. And Dr. O'Donnell will probably tell you that the clannish principle is a term that was pretty rife in anti-Catholic literature during this time too. Some critics were quite conscious of the tenuous balance here between religious freedom on one hand and ecclesiastical interference on the other, and tried to make their accusations clear. For instance, Thomas Sharp, the editor of the nearby Warsaw Signal, which was probably the hub of the animosity toward the church, explained that while the Mormons have the same rights as other religious bodies, as soon as they, as a people, step beyond the proper sphere of religious denomination, become a political body, Americans were forced to take a stand against them. The Saints, in other words, were seen as a menace to the nation's democratic process. What was at stake, in other words, was the nature of democracy itself. Was liberty the chance to freely operate within society? Or was it the ability to work within particular communities interwoven together beneath a broad national umbrella? Was religious freedom something to be experienced individually or collectively? Critics accused Mormons of subverting religious freedom and threatening democratic order. Mormons countered that they were merely exercising their religious freedom to act as a collective. To borrow contemporary terminology regarding corporate laws, the question regarded whether religions could act as persons. These tensions continued for the next few years as Joseph Smith became increasingly bold in his directives and the Saints increasingly determined to follow out his wishes. This included audacious interpretations of legal protections in an attempt to defend Joseph Smith on the 3 occurrences that Missouri tried to extradite him back for trial. Feel free to tee me up in the Q&A. Just say habeas corpus. As well, and more worrisome to Nauvoo's neighbors, was when state politicians continued to be unwilling to step in and put a stop, even to the most egregious of the saints' activities, as they feared any electoral backlash. So while the saints felt that they were finally victorious in establishing a safe space for the faith to flourish, onlookers worried that they had merely found a loophole. Neither side were willing to merely trust the traditional democratic system. If political and legal activities were what drove external opposition to Joseph Smith, it was the prophet's new domestic arrangements and theological cosmos that cultivated internal division. Perhaps the most poignant period for Smith's religious evolution, looking at all the signs on campus, I assume this is a group that appreciates innovation. So I'll use, correct me, you're ranked where on innovation? Perhaps the most poignant period for Smith's religious innovation was in the months between fall of 1840 and spring 1841. It was during that cold and bitter winter that Smith preached for the first time some of the doctrines that remain central to the LDS Church even today. The eternal nature of spirits, the divine union of families, the overwhelming connective power of the priesthood, and even baptisms for the dead. All of these developments were closely tethered to the other major project announced during this period, the new and grandiose temple that was to be built on the bluff overlooking the still inchoate city. While originally conceived to be quite similar to the structure that the saints had previously built in Ohio, as seen in these early architectural drawings, Smith's new doctrinal teachings, including a revelation that was soon canonized, transformed the temple's idea into something much more. The culmination of all of these new ideas and proposals was the temple's cornerstone ceremony, which was to take place at the church's 11th anniversary, April 6, 1841. Whereas the temple's cornerstone ceremony was a public event witnessed by thousands, an equally important ceremony took place that same week, only this one under the strict order of secrecy. On April 5th, the night before the celebration, Joseph Smith met with Louisa Beeman and Joseph Noble in a small grove, shielded from prying eyes. Noble was a longtime member of the church and close confidant of the prophet, and Beeman, who was disguised as a man by wearing a coat and hat on the occasion, was Noble's sister-in-law. All three knew that what they were about to do was neither legally nor socially acceptable, yet they each believed their actions was both necessary and enabled by the same priesthood authority that would preside over the cornerstone ceremony the next day. Acting as officiator, Noble then married Beeman to Smith as a plural wife. In the evolving Mormon terminology, this was referred to as a sealing or a marriage, as Smith and Beeman were now understood to be wed for eternity. While the cornerstone dedication received extensive newspaper coverage, none of the three individuals involved in the polygamous ritual left a contemporary record of the occasion. Only Noble ever discussed it, and he did so nearly 30 years after the event. For a faith that placed such immense significance on written records, the lack of textual evidence underscored the ceremony's strangeness. Yet the ideas behind the temple's construction also justified the private union. God's plan was to restructure society around a new order, and priesthood authority would create new relationships according to eternal principles. Humanity's arrangements were giving way to those of God's as mediated through an appointed prophet. The priestly keys that were staples to Smith's temple teachings also unlocked a new heavenly system of domestic ties. While it is impossible to know when the practice of polygamy began, it seems likely that most of its doctrine originated that winter of 1840 to 41, as Smith preached a new society that revolved around priesthood keys, familial networks, and eternal unions. Further, it is clear that the theology that Smith used to justify the practice evolved substantially over the next few years. Indeed, his understandings of and reasons for such a radical marital experiment was slowly pieced together as new individuals were added and new ideas were considered. The eventual product of Smith's theorizing on polygamy was therefore not a superficial endorsement for extramarital sex, but a vision of a multi-layered patriarchal hierarchy that governed the cosmos. The number of participants in the practice also grew substantially, even as it remained largely a secret. By 1844, Smith had wed over 30 women, and almost 100 other men and women entered the controversial order. By the time the saints left Nauvoo in 1846 and 47, over 200 men and 700 women had entered plural unions. The reason why so many individuals, especially women, embrace the practice can be difficult to determine. And to be clear, not everyone who is exposed to the idea accepted it. But the reasons for polygamy's expansion can, at least in part, be understood within its cultural context. On the one hand, the 19th century witnessed expanding, though still limited, opportunities for women in America, especially the religious sphere, in juxtaposition to the explicitly patriarchal structures promised to improve the lives of both wives and mothers. Many religions empowered their women congregants, as seen in the female divinity among the Shakers and Moravians, or even the activism of Methodists, of which Emma Smith, Joseph Smith's wife, remained an example even after her conversion to the LDS faith. Further, communitarian experiments like the Shakers, with their emphasis on abstinence, and the Oneida community, with their introduction of shared marriages, recast the family in ways that struck at the heart of traditional domestic homes. Yet at the same time, there was a significant backlash against these cultural developments, as some desired to return to more traditional and patriarchal orders. While America had always worried over the sanctity of the home, the tumultuous nature of the new and expanding republic, which plunged many into poverty, and the separation caused by constant personal movement during westward expansion, led many to grow increasingly concerned with what they viewed as a degradation of the social sphere. This was especially the case on the frontier, where traditional boundaries were continually challenged by new and rough realities. Mormon polygamy addressed these cultural currents at once. Joseph Smith's proposed system of both of these cultural currents at once. Joseph Smith's proposed system of sealing allegedly offered, through the authority of priestly networks, a safety net in a world of tumult. The common refrain found in the writings of women who entered polygamy in Nauvoo was an appeal to the security and permanence that those unions offered. They looked not so much for an intimate relationship as for the assurance of salvation and familial networks that could transcend the grave. One important person through which we can witness these anxieties is the prominent poetess and thinker Eliza R Snow. An educated and cultured woman, Snow had converted to the Mormon faith a decade earlier in Kirtland when she was a student at Oberlin College, and quickly became one of its foremost female voices. Tall, brown-haired, and always dressed in a dignified appeal, Snow was known for her poetry and hymns. And in March of 1842, she was chosen by Emma Smith to serve as a secretary for the new women's organization, the Relief Society. Then, several months later, in June, Emma's husband chose Eliza to be a plural wife. "This is a day of much interest to my feelings," she suddenly wrote in her journal on the day of her sealing. Though she did not record the details, she could not but help to hint at her confusion. But even if she could not fully comprehend them at the time, she knew the implications were immense. Now, why would someone of Snow's intelligence and stature accept Smith's new patriarchal order? Though she refused to offer explicit reasons at the time, her life story offers some hints. First and foremost, she was deeply committed both to the Mormon cause and the Mormon prophet. She later described her faith as unwavering and all the challenges worthwhile. Listening to Joseph Smith's teachings in the Relief Society and looking forward to the new rituals promised in the still under construction temple, Snow likely saw plural marriage as another step in a path toward personal sanctification and transcendence. Joseph Smith had promised the women of Nauvoo that they would join a kingdom of priests, a promise that Snow, as the organization's secretary, carefully recorded in their minute book. And polygamy was a path to becoming queens of this divine kingdom. Paradoxically, support for polygamy promised matriarchal power in their view. For Snow, this was a promise that could not be turned down easily. There are also likely more prosaic reasons for her yearning. To the Mormons of Nauvoo, as I've mentioned repeatedly, American democracy seemed a failed experiment that only brought death and destruction to those most in need of protection. What would happen to a woman like Snow, aged 38, who was beyond the typical age of courtship in a nation that left many vulnerable? How could American society take care of the never married, the widowed, the destitute? Federal and state governments refused to take responsibility, and charitable efforts were often haphazard. Religious groups, therefore, moved in the gap in their various ways. Especially after the tragedies encountered in Missouri, Snow was anxious to find redemption from lost opportunities and stabilities in a chaotic world, no matter how radical the solution appeared. Snow's account in her journal on the day of her secret marriage seemed to reflect this belief. Quote, while contemplating the present state of society, the powers of darkness and the prejudices of the human mind, which stand arrayed like an impregnable barrier against the work of God, Snow couldn't help but embrace the permanency offered by Smith's marital network. She likened the chaos of the wider world to the thunderstorm that rained down on her secret marriage day. The rage of elements, she mused, reminded her of the flimsy nature of human life and the storms that toss people to and fro. Polygamy was, at least for Snow, the force that could save her from a life of loss. She did not just want to be safe, she also wanted to help redeem a fallen world, a feeling she shared with thousands of converts to Mormonism and dozens of women who embraced polygamy. Her sealing allowed her to exercise a priesthood power that could finally bring order and sanctification. That reasoning was not as persuasive to everyone, of course. Just as there were followers willing to accept the controversial practice, there are others also within the church who saw it as a corruption of religion and a betrayal of morals. And when rumors of polygamy began to swirl, many took it upon themselves to root out the evil. Surprisingly, one of the person most in charge of leading this anti-polygamy cause was Hyrum Smith, Joseph Smith's own brother, and the second in command in the church. Starting in 1841, Hyrum, unaware of Joseph's activities, used the church's high council, then the most powerful ecclesiastical body in the city, to investigate and punish anyone practicing polygamy. The conflict between the actions of Joseph and Hyrum Smith, the former introducing new and controversial sexual arrangements, the latter attempting to shore up traditional values, had widespread effects over the next few years. Hyrum continued to marshal the High Council in his quest to cleanse the city of what he feared to be rampant sexual improprieties, nipping at the heels of the increasingly loud polygamous rumors. Eventually, when Hyrum made a remarkable and seemingly instantaneous conversion to polygamy in May of 1843, I'm happy to talk about more about that in the Q&A, he had already created a machine devoted to eradicating the very principle he now embraced. Indeed, it was when he attempted to introduce the idea of polygamy after he converted to it to the High Council in August of 1843, at a tense meeting in which, in the eyes of many there, Hyrum appeared to now defend the practice he had once abhorred, the internal schisms within Nauvoo became unbridgeable. Some on the council who had previously worked alongside Hyrum saw it as a betrayal, and a group of men who were in that meeting became the core of Nauvoo's resistance, culminating in a dissenting church and an expository newspaper the following spring. It was at that point, in the spring of 1844, that the two groups who disagreed with Joseph's societal vision, those inside Nauvoo who detested the new polygamous practice, and those outside Nauvoo who saw Joseph Smith as a political threat, joined together and posed a formidable challenge to Smith's life and the city's sovereignty. And it is the lead up to that conflict, as well as the bloody results and tragic aftermath that I cover in Kingdom of Nauvoo. It's a tale of political intrigue among local and state authorities, daring escapes from legal custody, secret rendezvous between men and women, and audacious political proposals, All I try to show within the backdrop of American culture brimming with societal change. And Mormon Nauvoo, I try to show, was at the center of these larger social transformations. Now, allow me to conclude with a few remarks concerning the broader lessons for today. Today, Nauvoo is home to only 2,000 residents, a fraction of the number who lived there during its Mormon heyday. However, it continues to serve as a sacred tourist destination for denominations linked to Joseph Smith. While the town remains a sleepy Midwestern city between September and May, a village with few stores and even fewer restaurants. During the summer, it is swarmed by thousands of believers from different Mormon faiths seeking out the city's history and tapping into its spiritual heritage. Both the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the institution that followed Brigham Young West, and the Community of Christ, formerly known as the Reorganized Church and founded by Joseph Smith's descendants, have built visitor centers, maintained historic homes, and reconstructed dozens of period buildings from the 1840s. If you want to know more about these competing religious visions, feel free to ask. The LDS Church even rebuilt the massive temple on the bluff in 2002. There are scripted pageants, games for children, and historic tours guided by earnest missionaries, both young and old. Some have dubbed Nauvoo the Mormon Williamsburg. But just like colonial Williamsburg, Nauvoo today offers only a partial view of the city's full history. Its beautiful brick homes distract from the reality that in the 1840s, Nauvoo predominantly consisted of dirty wooden shacks. Its self-presentation as a pilgrimage destination and as a necessary but intermediary step on the way to Utah belies the fact that the Mormons under Smith had wanted to build their kingdom on the banks of the Mississippi. Further, historic tours put on by faithful missionaries rarely cover the radical political, social, and domestic arrangements that were at the heart of Joseph Smith's Nauvoo vision. That vision had as much to do with democracy as anything else. And this is why Nauvoo and its failure matters. The question the Mormons posed was not just about the boundaries of religious liberty. It also concerned the limits of American democracy. Today, however divided and cacophonous our political and cultural battles may be, few believe that the only solution is to abandon the American experiment altogether. But the Mormons did just that, decades before Southern secession. Democracy was envisioned to manage different interests and assure individual freedoms. In Nauvoo, that process broke down. After facing repeated opposition, the Mormons determined that the only way to achieve stability and assure their rights was to question traditional American principles and, when that failed to bring redress, flagrantly challenge existing traditions and institutions. In response, both their state and federal government leaders proved unsympathetic to their pleas and their Gentile neighbors exacting in their revenge. Yet the Saints were far from the first, nor the last, group of dissenters to call into question traditional values in a desperate quest to realize acceptance, however misbegun, within a society driven by majoritarian control. And even if their solutions only brought more problems, their struggles highlight real questions concerning democratic rule. So if we are to account for the full history of American democracy, then, we must give voice not only to its victors, but also its discontents. Thank you. I'm happy to take any questions. How long do we have before I get kicked out?
Everything about habeas corpus.
Any questions? Kick things off. Someone be a brave person.
You're a great speaker.
Oh, well, thank you.
Gosh, I'm so excited. How did Joseph Smith maintain 30 women?
That is a great question. So the question is so much about polygamy in Nauvoo. We don't know much about because they didn't leave much of a written record, right? They knew it was illegal. It would break the bigamy laws in the States. So like one of the most important documents we have from this time, Joseph Smith writes while he's in hiding on a related thing, and he writes a family that includes a daughter that he had just been sealed to as a plural wife. And at the end of the document, he says, burn this letter after you read it, which as a historian just makes you cringe, because they're like, how much you want to go out and just dig up those old fire pits and see what you can find. It's important to note that polygamy was never really formalized as a public institution in Nauvoo, right? Because it was secret. They're not going to have, like a multi-family house. Okay. So most of the women who were sealed to Joseph Smith as a polygamous wife, they went on their everyday lives as if they weren't sealed to him. We have fragments of information that they might have had a house outside of Nauvoo in the event that a polygamous wife, either Joseph Smith or others, got pregnant. What do we do with them? Well, maybe we'll put them in this house far away. We'll hide them away. But yeah, it wasn't until the Mormons moved out to Utah after Nauvoo that they formally announced that, hey, we're practicing polygamy, the worst kept secret in the world by that point. That they actually had to institute, okay, maybe we need to have formal guidelines of how to operate. So it's a good question. Yeah.
I have a polygamy question too.
It's common, don't worry.
Trying to be a stereotype, but so it's interesting to me that it was kind of pitched as like an idea of like offering stability, but also offering empowerment to women. Mm-hmm. And how has that evolved since then? Like, I don't currently view it that way, but maybe I'm wrong.
Yeah, so it's a great question, because to us in our modern minds, like that just seems paradoxical is a kind way to put it, right? So I think there are two elements. One, people are free to take the skeptical critique that like this is just Joseph Smith promising a certain thing to get buy-in, right? And you can't dismiss that explanation. But when trying to reconstruct the mindset of those who were involved, including the many women who were sealed in polygamous unions, they viewed it as, entering this hierarchical cosmos, right? We tend to think about families today in, our nuclear family model with a husband and wife and children, which, in conservative Christian culture, that's what the traditional family is. Back then, the Mormons, in rejecting that, they're like, it's not the nuclear family that matters. And I know that's ironic for those who know the modern LDS rhetoric today. What mattered back then is this hierarchical authoritative family structure. So there was actually one point where a Mormon leader drew what he called a diagram of the kingdom of God and how a family operates. Am I allowed to use this? To where he said, in every family kingdom, there is going to be a king. Maybe I'm not allowed to use it.
There's a round one on the left.
All right, let's see. There, I got two more, and then I'll give up. I know these people use it. Oh, we got one. All right. He said, you have a king at the top, and underneath you have various families who are sealed to different women, or by the time after Joseph Smith dies, they introduce this practice they call the law of adoption, where entire families are sealed up into different families. So underneath each pedigree line, you have other authoritative lines going down. Now we look at this today and we say, like, this is a family tree. But back then, do I have any medieval historians in the room? There's a common concept that's known as the, oh goodness, I knew it 5 seconds ago. The chain of being, right? This idea of the chain of being, of how humanity and all these different societies ordered in the world. And that's what a family was supposed to be. It was an authoritative, strong sense of everyone being sealed together. And that's the only thing that's going to survive in the eternities. And part of that was practicing the sense of matriarchal power that women embraced. Now, what happened is polygamy, when it was given up, there was a question of, well, how do women fit into this cosmos now? Because one, you could say, one of the ironic side points, occurrences that come with polygamy was women was granted this access to this priesthood structure through polygamy. Once you cut out that priesthood structure, how do women have access to authority? And the answer is, well, they've been trying to answer that question ever since. And so, in many ways, you get this, this resurrection in the LDS community in the last 50 years, to where a lot of Mormon women in the 1970s were exposed to Mormon women's writings in the 19th century. And they're like, holy hell, they were women activists. They had a sense of authority and control and empowerment. And what do we have now? We have nothing in their mind, right? And so it ended up causing this discussion. So that's one of the great ironies of Mormon gender power. And I will note one more thing, that when we talk about gendered empowerment in Nauvoo, it's not a, teleological march from women are not empowered to women are empowered at the end. Instead, it's kind of a roller coaster ride where Joseph Smith is empowering women with this new Relief Society organization, 1842. He's giving them a role in the public sphere. He's telling them that you can speak out on political issues, you can police morality. Mormon women are practicing a sense of social control that very few women's organizations are doing in America. And Joseph Smith is thrilled with that, especially because they're defending his honor against public accusations. Until Emma Smith, who does not like polygamy, starts marshaling that same Relief Society organization to now attack polygamy. Okay. And then at that point, Joseph Smith, it seems like he regrets in some ways. And so he almost tries to abolish the Relief Society, and they lose their power. So even in Joseph Smith's time, you can't say that there's one sense of women's empowerment. It fluctuates depending on the different cultural circumstances. Great question. Yeah.
How did Joseph Smith's views on race during the Nauvoo period influence those of, let's say, Brigham Young in the Utah period, and maybe how they continue to affect those in the Mormon faith?
It's such a great question. So Joseph Smith had a very unsystematic approach to race. Like many American Northerners in the antebellum period, he was kind of everywhere. He was theoretically anti-slavery. He had some pretty strong statements against slavery, but he was also anti-abolitionist, right? He was like many Northerners who saw abolitionists as kind of disrupting society. He produced some scripture that seem to say that all races are equal. In fact, there's a passage in the Book of Mormon that says all black, white, bond, and free are equal before God. He produced other scripture, what comes to be known as the Book of Abraham, that others would later come to see as giving kind of a racial curse that buys into the broader American myth of Ham and Abraham, and saying that there are not only different races that are distinguished by God and that they have different roles, and there's a curse placed on one of them. Joseph Smith did seem to either ordain or approve the ordination of several black men to priesthood functions during his lifetime. He was still against interracial marriage like many others. And then, so that's partially his view on African Americans. And then he maintained a number of correspondence and networking with indigenous tribes in the area. In fact, there are a number of indigenous tribes and tribal leaders who would come to Nauvoo and talk to Joseph Smith, basically saying, hey, we're both being persecuted by the American government here. Maybe we should band together. And that did not go over well with Nauvoo's neighbors, who are now viewing Mormons as maybe in cahoots with their indigenous enemies. And then, so to get to your question, what happens afterward? So Joseph Smith leaves this inchoate, multifaceted legacy, where there are some things that you might determine as progressive, some that are quite conservative. Brigham Young takes it in a certain direction. So within a few years of Joseph Smith's death, Brigham Young introduces a new racial restriction that not only bars black men from holding the priesthood, but bars black women from access to temple rituals. They also initially have what they hope would be a positive interactions with indigenous tribes out in the West. When they were moving out, they sent delegates to tribal confederations to say, hey, maybe we should work together, though always in a patronizing way of, hey, you should work under us. And then by the time they get out to Utah, they mostly act like other white settlers, and they dispossess the Ute and the Shoshone and the Navajo and the region. And what's remarkable over all this story is you have converts from indigenous and black backgrounds who are witnessing this transformation and are in many ways attesting to how it used to be. There was a black man by the name of Elijah Abel, who was ordained to the priesthood under Joseph Smith, who is pretty upset with the direction Brigham Young takes it. There's a black woman, Jane Manning James, who joins the church, lives in Joseph Smith's own house, claims that Joseph Smith had offered her access to temple rituals, and then until her death petitions church leaders to, hey, Joseph Smith promised me a temple ritual, and then they never accede to his request. And then there was an indigenous man by the name of Louis Dana, who is not only ordained to the priesthood, but is allowed to marry a white woman, and then goes out to preach the gospel, and then comes back after Joseph Smith's death and kind of experiences a whole new church and eventually leaves because he disagrees with Brigham Young's direction. So I think you see in Mormonism, like not surprisingly, what you see in Methodists and Baptists in the early Republic, maybe an initial openness and then followed by racial retrenchment. So does that answer the question?
Just the last part, how do you think that, I guess, are there still lingering effects, those?
Today? Yeah, no, absolutely. Because the Mormon faith is still having to rectify or come to grips with these racial policies that are rooted from this early period, either from Joseph Smith or Brigham Young. I mean, just this last week, there was a prominent LDS speaker who repeated a myth that African Americans weren't ordained to the priesthood all the way up until 1978, ignoring the fact that Elijah Abel and others in Nauvoo were ordained to the priesthood. And because LDS leaders are often hesitant to ever undercut previous prophets by saying they were wrong, in part because they don't want to undercut their current authority, they haven't been able to fully reconcile it. So as a result, we just kind of have these legacies that remain from Nauvoo that can be used as a usable past in some ways, but in other ways often crop up every once in a while because church leaders still are like, we have Joseph Smith's teachings on this on one way, but on this other way. And because we try to unify that vision, it doesn't work.
Thank you.
It was real bad. Maxwell Cox.
That's right. Yeah.
So there's a few online questions. First one from Robert. As a historian of apocalypticism, I just want to say that I am highly appreciative of your work engaging with and taking serious alternative religious views of democracy. Too often scholars write off the apocalyptically minded as politically disengaged, when in fact they are actually proposed alternative models or offering serious critiques of the dangers inherent in democracy and political power. Could you say a bit more about Mormon, and I'm going to say this word wrong, eschatology?
Eschatology,
and how it shapes their political and social.
Yeah, it's a great question, because this all comes down to this type of millenarian thinking that where if you think that God or Jesus Christ is coming back in his second coming to, cleanse the earth, then what's the use of improving the earth, right? So the Mormons, so that plays a role. And there's a debate of concerning whether you believe Jesus has to initiate the millennium or whether you cause the millennium and then Jesus comes at the end. With the Mormons, they maintained these anxieties simultaneously. On the one hand, they believe that we have to do our work of redemption on the earth. On the other hand, Christ is going to come at any moment and it's going to make all this, the opposition moot. And perhaps the most clear example of a tangible result of this, highfalutin idea is that the Mormons were never too concerned with long-term ramifications of the policies and actions they were taking, right? Their philosophy on politics, so whether what they believe on the federal government, federal power intervention, state sovereignty, whatever, they never had a consistent political philosophy. Because their whole game was kind of, to borrow the March Madness metaphor, survive in advance. We are going to take the political position now that is expedient for our immediate future. Because, the end is near, and so we just need to survive for now, and then eventually God's going to take care of it in the long run. So I think there used to be a time to where scholars would look at apocalyptic religions and they'd be like, either they're apocalyptic and therefore they don't care about politics, or they're political and they don't care about the apocalyptic. Where I think for the Mormons, that's a false binary, because they were very apocalyptic, and as a result of that, they took certain political actions. Yeah.
Another online question from Radesh. What happened to Emma Smith when Joseph died?
Yeah, such a great question. So Joseph Smith dies in June of 1844, killed by a mob while held in state custody. Joseph, among his many great strengths, was never a clear institutional thinker in terms of succession. So some scholars have been able to, digging through Joseph Smith's records, have claimed that Joseph Smith left as many as 6 to 9 different potential succession paths after his death, of whether it should be this person, this ecclesiastical office, this person, this ecclesiastical office, Joseph Smith's children. It was not very clear. Very soon, Brigham Young, who held the position in the Quorum of the 12 Apostles and the leader of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles, he ends up being one of the most outspoken, and he kind of wins a battle with most of the succession claimants, at least for the first few years. But not everyone is happy with that, because in Brigham Young's mind, there were certain things of Joseph Smith's mission that were necessary to be expanded in order to both secure the church and secure Brigham Young's position in the church. One of those central tenets was polygamy. So as Brigham Young saw Joseph Smith practice this in quiet and private, now we need to expand it out further. So just within a few months of Joseph Smith's death, Brigham Young is sealed to something like 30 more women, including nearly, that was the right reaction. That was actually, I paid her to do that. That was Emma Smith's reaction. You might not know. Including among those sealed to Brigham Young during that time were about half of the women who were sealed to Joseph Smith, almost as clearly taking over Joseph Smith's kingdom. Emma Smith, not a fan. She saw, in Emma Smith's mind, polygamy was where Mormonism went wrong. That's where Joseph Smith fell short. And so when she looked at Brigham Young, she saw Brigham Young taking Mormonism in its worst route. And so when Brigham Young took a majority of the saints out west, at its peak, the Nauvoo region had about 20,000 saints. About 13,000 of them followed Brigham Young. So a majority of them followed Brigham Young out west, but a number stayed in the area, including Emma Smith. Emma Smith stayed in Nauvoo, and there were various new Mormon denominations. There was one guy who I wish I had a lot more time to talk about, a guy by the name of James J. Strain, who appears on the scene shortly after Joseph Smith's death and said, "Hey, Joseph Smith appeared to me as an angel, ordained me to be a new prophet. I was led to dig up new sacred records that were buried under a tree, and I have 3 and 8 witnesses to attest to this." Does this story sound familiar, right? It's kind of Joseph Smith reincarnate, and he ends up leading several thousand saints. And so there's various breakoff groups like that in the area. But eventually by 1860, a number of those who really missed the good old days of Mormonism, back before the Nauvoo craziness, approached Emma Smith's family and said, it's time to reorganize the church. And that's when Joseph Smith III becomes a prophet of the reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, although they didn't add the reorganized name until later. And Emma Smith supports her son in that position. Emma Smith lives in Nauvoo until her death. She remarries about a year and a half after Joseph Smith's death, actually remarries on Joseph Smith's birthday. Ironic. I don't know if you want to read into that or not. She, to her death, she wanted to be a firm proponent of the Mormonism that she loved. And so whenever you would have journalists or other Mormon missionaries coming into the city and ask her about Mormonism, she could go on and on about her role in helping produce the Book of Mormon, of early Mormonism, the hymns, all the religious experiences. And then she would clam up when talking about polygamy. And she decided that in her mind, for her to function, Joseph Smith was not a polygamist. And she denied that Joseph Smith practiced polygamy. And that ended up being one of the foundational arguments of the new reorganized church, was that polygamy was invented by Brigham Young and the saints out west, and that Joseph Smith was not tainted by that. So Emma died in Nauvoo a couple decades later, surrounded by her sons and her new husband. And she ends up, the man that she marries, Louis Bideman, ends up, as if Emma didn't have a hard enough life, he ends up cheating on her and having a child with another woman. And then Emma takes in that child and raises her as her own.
Emma is the MVP.
Yeah, that's right. Hashtag Team Emma.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
You mentioned, I was struck by the account of Hiram Smith, the brother of Joseph Smith, out in public working against polygamy while his brother, the head of the church, is promoting it.
Right.
that suggests that there was like a public theology and a secret theology going on, and then some people went on a secret theology and some weren't.
Yep.
How did that work?
Not well. You end up having these, I'm going to justify that I actually found a marker by using it one more time. You end up having this big circle of Mormonism, right? Mormonism gets something like 60,000 converts during Joseph Smith's life, spread across America and the United Kingdom. I mean, they're taking in thousands of converts in England. Most of these people who convert to Mormonism, we don't really know what happens with them after they convert. They embrace Mormonism, and to them, Mormonism was believing in this new scripture, believing that there's this restoration, and then going on with the rest of your life. Among this big circle of those who join Mormonism, scholars like to call them the ungathered. Right? Within this big circle of Mormonism, you have a circle, man, we're running out of this marker, this is bad. You have a smaller circle of the gathered, those who joined the church in Nauvoo and summon the call when Joseph Smith says, once you join the church, you should come and live in Nauvoo. So most of the saints come and live in church headquarters. And by the time that Joseph Smith dies, if you were to walk the streets of Nauvoo, 1 out of every 4 people you met would have spoke with a British accent because they came from recent boats of converts in England. In this big church that's in Nauvoo, there's a smaller circle of those who are close to Joseph Smith and maybe hearing him preach on Sundays and learning his doctrines and are pretty close. Within that circle, you have another circle, maybe Smith's closest followers, those who know about polygamy, those who know about the Council of 50, which is this clandestine political organization he creates in his last life. And you can be a member of these various spheres of Mormonism and have no idea of what's going on closer in. So for instance, when Brigham Young, one of Brigham Young's first actions, although I mean it takes a little bit after he takes control, is he starts to decide that this leads to instability. I mean, that's a correct assumption. So his decided he's going to be much more open about all of it. Which the downside is, a lot of the people who are out here who did not know that polygamy was going on, that political involvement was going on, they reject Mormonism and they walk away. But those who are the core believers, they stay with Brigham Young and embrace polygamy and they embrace these other things. So in Nauvoo, you have Joseph Smith preaching from the pulpit, the Mormons do not practice polygamy. Or he would use coded words like the Mormons don't practice spiritual wifery. But then in practice, he'd be practicing polygamy. I was talking to James earlier today when we were doing a recorded interview about we often expect these historical figures, especially these big religious leaders, to be consistent in their thought, to have a coherent theology, which I don't know why they do that, because I don't want to speak for all of you, but I'm hardly coherent in my thoughts. And especially when we have priorities and anxieties, we can often go on different tracks simultaneously. Joseph Smith had 2 driving ideas and ideals and priorities in Nauvoo. One, he came to believe that polygamy was central to expanding Mormonism internally. On the other hand, he believed that any whiff of polygamy making it in the public sphere was going to result in the destruction of Mormonism. Those 2 things don't go together, but they did in Joseph Smith's mind, or at least he tried to. So you would have this public theology and that would end up being why so many people might react violently to Joseph Smith when they learn about polygamy. It's not just learning about polygamy. It was learning that you lied to me when you said we weren't practicing polygamy. And so then it was a betrayal. And that's what resulted in a dissenting church. These people who are in Nauvoo but aren't in the inner circle, finding out about the inner circle, and they decide to break off and say, we're taking Mormonism back to its true roots. And so that's what happens in Joseph Smith's last life. A number of people who we would say in this circle, not even the broader Nauvoo circle, but like the medium circle, find out about Joseph Smith's polygamy, decide that he was a fallen prophet. That would be the term they use. So he was once a prophet, but now he's a fallen prophet. And we're going to organize our own church, and we're going to start our own newspaper exposing all that Joseph Smith is doing. This comes to be known as the Nauvoo Expositor. And in their mind, they were saving the church because they're saving this church by destroying this church. Joseph Smith sees this as a threat and he orders the newspaper destroyed. And that's what ends up leading him being in jail and killed by mob. So being killed by a mob is about as bad an outcome of a public-private divide could be, I would say. Yeah, in the back.
So we were promised a conversation about habeas corpus.
Okay, habeas corpus. So let me take, I need a drink, we're digging in here. What was that? That's right. Brought to you by Shapers. Joseph Smith was imprisoned in Missouri, and he was in prison for about 7 to 8 months. And then he is let out. We think that he was probably imprisoned in Missouri basically as hostage to get the rest of the Mormons out of the state. And once the rest of the Mormons are out of the state, they let Joseph Smith out. Missouri probably assumed that that was the end of the Mormon story and that they weren't going to have to worry about it anymore. When Joseph Smith remained a problem in their mind, at least, they decided, well, you know what? We still have this charge hanging over Joseph Smith's mind, including the charge of treason from a number of things that took place in Missouri. So they write out an arrest warrant to arrest Joseph Smith and extradite him back to Illinois. This happens 3 times. In each time, the saints turn to habeas corpus free. So those of you who don't have a legal background and don't know these Latin terms like habeas corpus, like I didn't know before this project, habeas corpus is a legal mechanism in which if you are arrested, you can try something for habeas corpus for a judge to determine whether your arrest followed proper procedure. Right? Habeas corpus is present the body. So were you arrested? So a habeas corpus ruling says nothing about the case that's brought against you. It's just about the process of the arrest. When Joseph Smith was first arrested on the first extradition attempt, again, there are 3 extradition attempts, in 1841, Stephen A. Douglas is a circuit judge. He's also still an adamant Democratic politician. And in trying to court the Mormon votes for the Democrats, he says, well, bring your case before me and I will grant you a writ of habeas corpus. Right? It was a purely political move. And the saints are like, hey, that was pretty cool. This habeas corpus thing really works. Now, there's a debate about whether they just fundamentally didn't understand habeas corpus because, in fact, there was an Illinois law that if you are granted a writ of habeas corpus, the state is then obligated to issue another arrest warrant to properly arrest you on the charges, right? Because it doesn't get you free on the charge, just on the arrest. But Joseph Smith and the saints believed that when they were granted a writ of habeas corpus, that just erased that trial, that case altogether. So that's extradition attempt number 1. Extradition attempt number 2. The saints are like, well, that habeas corpus thing works so well, maybe we should do it on our own. So Joseph Smith is arrested. There's a writ of habeas corpus for his arrest in the summer of 1842. And the saints in Nauvoo, the city council passes a new resolution that grants the Nauvoo Municipal Court the authority to try any cases that originate outside the city. Those of you who have any legal background know that that's not how it works, right? In fact, at one point, the saints passed a law that said any court case or any arrest warrant that originates outside the city for actions taking place away from city and signed from an authority above the city still had to be tried in the city on a writ of habeas corpus. In their minds, if we were to use the sympathetic mindset of why did the saints feel like that was justified, they would say, well, this is America. And in America, we're promised a trial by our peers. As Mormons, surrounded by anti-Mormons, the only trial of our peers is here in Nauvoo. And so they pass all these writs, and they grant Joseph Smith the writ of habeas corpus on the second extradition attempt. The state is like, that's not how this works. And so Joseph Smith goes on the run for several months until finally the state was like, actually, there is a case to be made for habeas corpus, but you need to go through the actual court system. Joseph Smith agrees. Joseph Smith is freed at the end of the year, and he's free. Huzzah, one more victory. Joseph Smith, once again, thinks that things are fine. And that summer, the summer of 1843, there's another attempt to arrest Joseph Smith. And this time, the city once again passes a writ of habeas corpus to free Joseph Smith through this very fascinating story that I won't bore you with right now. And the state, remember the state the year before said, you can't do that. You need to go through the official state system. In 1843, they have a different interpretation, say, you know what, we're gonna say your state or your city municipal court has the authority to do that. Anyone want to guess why? Because there was an election the next month.
Oh.
And the state politicians wanted the Mormons to vote for them. And so they basically go, they look at it and they're like NFL referees, it's good. You're fine, just follow that. Think about this from the perspective of those outside Nauvoo now. They now see Joseph Smith as above the law, that the law is not going to be able to contain them because anytime Joseph Smith is arrested, the city of Nauvoo is going to grant him a writ of habeas corpus. This gets even worse. The spring of late winter, early spring of 1844, when a guy by the name of Sylvester Smith, no relations to Joseph Smith, arrives in Nauvoo and says, hey, I'm in trouble. There is some anti-Mormon persecution going on. It's really not anti-Mormon persecution. He was doing some bad stuff, but he says, the state or the territory of Iowa is about to try to arrest me. And this is persecution. You need to save me. So Joseph Smith instructs the municipal court to grant him a writ of habeas corpus before an arrest warrant is even issued, which is as close to a real life get out of jail free card as you can. This fills the newspapers saying like, this is the Mormons finding a way, a loophole to get themselves out. So this is why when Joseph Smith is arrested and held in state custody in a county jail, the citizens of Warsaw are like, no, we've seen this story before. We know the ending. And that's why they decide their only way to actually bring Joseph Smith to justice was to kill him. So, James, you had a question.
Yeah, I asked you all my challenging questions earlier in our talk, but one that just didn't fit into the way the talk went was, and actually goes along with your concentric circles. When I was reading your book, one of the things that I wanted to know more about is the thousands of people who come from the UK on ships to Nauvoo, which is something that I didn't know about. So I'm curious, both in terms of quantity, but also who these people are.
Yeah, so there was a common stereotype that flooded the newspaper coverage that they're all coming from the dregs of society, that they're the people that industrial Britain had left behind, and here's a promise of a new world and a new start to come to Nauvoo. That wasn't perfectly true, but it was kind of close. So most of the people who followed Joseph Smith's call in the 1840s from the UK were those who, like in America, were looking for some form of redemption, a new purpose. And I mean, the appeal of America was drawing this is at the same decade that thousands of Irish immigrants, Catholic immigrants are coming into the New World. And so I think you see a very similar thing. And it helped that the Mormons seemed to be very organized. They were running their own ships. They, had the charters with the different companies. And so this was a way for you to go out to do a new start. So starting in 1841, nearly every, few months during the shipping season, you would have a ship, a boat docking at the Nauvoo harbor, unloading hundreds, if not thousands of immigrants. And what's important is the people who were in charge of the British mission was the Quorum of the 12 and Brigham Young and them, which was quite important because up until Nauvoo, the Quorum of the 12 and Brigham Young's position was not that authoritative over the church. They were basically missionaries. But they start gaining stature in Nauvoo so that when the succession crisis happens after Joseph Smith's death, a majority of the British converts, they're already used to seeing Brigham Young as a leader, which I think was probably a major part for why most of the converts who followed Brigham Young were those who came from Britain. And I think that ends up shaping a lot of Mormon culture. I mean, those of you who know Utah recognize that like the beehive is the key symbol. The beehive was the working man's symbol from industrial Britain, right? So I think if you went to territorial Utah in the 1850s and 1860s, you would find whole communities that were Welsh and Swedish and British. They almost organized by their ethnic background. And that was so like territorial Utah was probably about as international as any other community you'd find in America at that time. Yeah.
So online, Julian says, thank you so much for an engaging talk. I'm sorry if you mentioned this at the beginning, I joined a little late, but I was wondering if the book expands beyond Nauvoo and considers Mormon flight into what is today Utah, but what was then part of Mexico.
Right.
It seems that your argument about Mormons seeing the U.S. as a failure is even further strengthened by their decision to emigrate and leave the U.S.
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't deal with the migration. My book ends with migration, but I do close with the idea that they were purposely leaving America, right? If they were to immigrate the year before, in 1845, their main idea of where they were going to immigrate was Texas. In fact, they started a secret correspondence with Texas leaders about settling down at what's present-day Nacogdoches, for those of you who know Texas, which begs the question of who would want to settle there, but anyways. My favorite part of this, though, is when they're writing in Joseph Smith's diary that we send delegates down to Texas, they said, well, this is secret. You know, we're corresponding with, Texas was the Republic of Texas at the time, right? They weren't part of America. And they're like, well, we need to hide what we're doing. So they erased Texas and they instead wrote Saxit, Texas backwards. And then I just imagine them going, nailing it. But what then happens? Texas is annexed. So they decide we're not going to Texas anymore. And that's why they decide we're going to northern Mexico. At first, they thought they'd go to what's now present-day California, but then they're seeing more immigrants there. They thought that Mexico was going to be a good place to go because they saw, especially northern Mexico, what was referred there was didn't have many Spanish colonizers up there. Of course, like many Americans, they saw it as uninhabited, right? Because they just erased the indigenous populations who live out there. And so they thought that that would be a good settlement. So when they left, they were kind of, they were saying goodbye to America. They said that America had failed. We're saying goodbye. And then the ironic part, of course, I think I've said ironic 50 times. This is a story of irony. The ironic part is as they're marching out, what's going on in 1847? The US-Mexico War, right? So as soon as they're settling out there, the Treaty of Guadalupe within a year makes that territory part of America again. And they once again have to switch to decide what they're going to do. So.
It makes sense with your comment about the politics earlier. They're just going with whatever makes sense for them at the moment.
Yeah, exactly.
At that moment, it made sense to switch backsides and fight for it.
Right, exactly. Once they were on the march out and the US government comes to them and says, hey, we need your help in the US-Mexico war, we'll pay you. The Saints decide, well, okay, maybe we are part of America. And they send men on what comes to be known as the Mormon Battalion so that they can get much needed resources. But in one of my favorite notes here, when they march in the Mormon Battalion, they decide to fly an American flag with 13 stars as opposed to the 34 or whatever were at the time, because they're like, we're marching for the original American vision, even if we don't support the contemporary one. Yeah, we got it, hand in the back.
You mentioned that Joseph Smith was influenced by the Oneida version of the family. Is there evidence that he was influenced by other indigenous communities, either in New York or Illinois?
So it's a good question. I don't know if he was so much influenced by them as much as they were all being influenced by the same common culture, right? I think a lot of scholars who have looked at Mormonism are trying to find direct connections of Emanuel Swedenborg gives Joseph Smith the vision of the deities. Or, you know, so-and-so had this idea and Joseph Smith picks it up. I think that's often a fool's errand because Joseph Smith was hardly systematic in thinking, very eclectic in when he's taking ideas. And I think it'd be impossible to trace where exactly he's getting ideas. Instead, I think that Joseph Smith is responding to the same cultural anxieties that the Oneida community is responding to, that those on the frontier are responding to. And I think trying to find those cultural anxieties is a more fruitful way to determine where Joseph Smith is being influenced. Yeah.
From what I gather from your talk, it seems to echo a lot of the narratives that we see in the Joseph Smith papers and dialogue and so on. How does your book expand on the discourse surrounding Nauvoo? How do I expand on the existing historiography of Nauvoo? My primary goal in the book is like the bigger projects. I want to show how we can understand broader issues of American history through Nauvoo,
right? Too many historians in the past have tried to show Nauvoo as kind of exceptional from the rest of what's going on. If you look at a lot of the books of Nauvoo, it's Mormonism's flight from pluralism, or Mormonism's embrace of the democratization process. When in reality, I don't think American culture nor Mormons were ever fully systematic or, exclusive, that instead we can understand broader degrees of American history through Mormons. So like, that's the broader thing. Specifically, there's a few smaller things that I hope to, interventions that I hope to make with the book. I think there's a timeline of polygamy acceptance and development that I try to tease out in ways that I don't think had been understood before. I think Joseph Smith's broader political aims and activities, I think, had been kind of misunderstood by previous historians. Like at one point, I didn't even mention Joseph Smith ran for the presidency in 1844. Yes. I think people had misunderstood Joseph Smith's politics. And so I tried to unpack that. I mean, the great people behind the Joseph Smith Papers Project probably know what was going on in Nauvoo and like the meticulous details better than anyone, including myself. I mean, their lives, right, is understanding those documents and the people behind them. I'm trying to take the broader picture. What happens when we connect these things? And one last thing that I think my primary intervention is if you look at the historiography of Nauvoo, there's all the stories of politics, theological innovation, militia and whatnot, and here. And then there's polygamy and women over here. And I tried to show that those two spheres were embedded together. And you can't understand Nauvoo's political development without understanding what women were doing in Nauvoo. And you can't understand polygamy without understanding what's going on in the political sphere either. Yeah.
So Jared asks, I think many LDS people would view your book as an unflattering portrait of Joseph Smith. How do you respond to those who say you can't write an accurate history of him and his church unless you do so from a faithful perspective, because you can't really understand him without having faith in his call?
Yeah, so it's a very important question, and one that I'm sympathetic to, because those of us who write on religion recognize that we're dealing with sacred topics and sacred people for things, right? And it's important to note that when you're writing something in a secular vein for a general public, you can't carry theological baggage that is not only present in religious writing, but necessary for religious writing, right? What I write, Kingdom of Nauvoo, is not meant to be a book that's read for uplifting faith, right? There are different purposes for those texts. I'll also answer the question of, why would some view my book as unflattering? As I was talking to James in our interview today, much of our work is often framed by questions we ask, right? What questions we bring to the table is going to frame our analysis we make and the arguments we lead with. And so, for instance, a number of you might be familiar with Richard Bushman's classic biography of Joseph Smith, Russell Bowling, which is just a masterful work. If you read that book, it's a very different Joseph Smith than my book. And I think one of the reasons why is the driving question for Richard Bushman's book was what led tens of thousands of people to see Joseph Smith as a prophet, right? That's a legitimate historical question, right? Trying to understand those followers' minds. So as a result, it's going to be a very sympathetic narrative that will acknowledge Joseph Smith's flaws, but still in the framework of understanding what led him to be a successful prophet. One of the driving questions of my book was understanding why a group of otherwise law-abiding and peaceful citizens of Hancock County came to see Joseph Smith as such a threat that they decided to kill him in cold blood. If you're going in with those different questions, you're going to get very different Joseph Smiths. And so I would like to think that my book could be read by someone who believes Joseph Smith to be a prophet, but acknowledging that there's going to be moments when there's going to come in a clash of a historical figure and a mythic figure. And I don't want to say that in a way to say that, downplaying a mythic figure, that's, something that's superficial that those who don't understand the history do. Mythic figures are crucial for history or for religion. That's how religions flourish, right? You give meaning and transcendence to people. And just because that doesn't come through an academic writing doesn't mean that it's still not legitimate. It's just different spheres. Yeah.
So I'm interested in what prevents Joseph Smith from becoming Robert the Bias, right? And part of what intrigued me about your book is the isolation of Nauvoo, right? You mentioned that Quincy is nearby, but Quincy is, 14 hours by foot, right? Like, I'm from that area. Quincy and Nauvoo weren't close now. And so it strikes me as someone like Matthias, who's in upstate New York, but is being kind of interlocked with this expansion of transportation. There's far more direct pull from places like Albany, places like New York City, that aren't present from, say, Quincy, right? And if Nauvoo was closer to Quincy, are we reading a different story of Nauvoo?
It's a good question. So for those of you who aren't familiar, there's a wonderful book called Kingdom of Matthias, which that was my model when I wrote this book. You can almost see in Kingdom of Nauvoo, Kingdom of Matthias, type of thing. I also wanted it to be 70,000 words like Kingdom of Matthias, and there's just way too much stuff to cover. So what made Joseph Smith a different problem? I think geography is one thing, right? But more, I think Joseph Smith proposed a more appealing vision of community than Matthias did. All right? I mean, when you take a step back, Matthias's community was a dozen people who, gave full credit to him being, the Matthias resurrected figure with, strong religious authority. Joseph Smith's was a more successful blend of both those authoritative patriarchal visions, but still kind of a democratizing impulse where there are going to be lots of elders and there's going to be lots of participation in this religion. And so, I mean, even by the time that Joseph Smith is forced out of New York, where Mormonism was initially founded, he already had far more founders than Robert Matthias ever did. But as a result of that, there are downsides because he was also seen as more of a threat. Because Robert Matthias isn't seen as a major threat until after his community falls apart. If it wasn't for him stealing his children away and then being seen as a threat, the authorities probably never would have got involved. What made Mormonism so dangerous was its appeal to thousands of people. Right. So I think because Joseph Smith was able to present a vision that was able to take in more followers, it made him both more successful as well as more of a threat than Matthias ever was. And for those of you who don't know, Matthias and Joseph Smith end up meeting each other when Matthias goes out visiting in Kirtland, a meeting of the prophets. Yeah.
So Lynn is asking, I read Emma Smith's friend of Richard's sister with a knife because of polygamy. Was she the only one?
Why was she the only one? So Emma Smith, as I mentioned, was not a fan of polygamy. And how she came to know polygamy, we'll never fully know. She probably learned it in bits and pieces. But one of the big aha moments for her was at one point she realized that not only was Joseph Smith married to more women than she thought he was, but that he was married to some women that she was close to, including the Partridge sisters. There are several accounts of Emma Smith threatening some of Joseph Smith's wives, showing a knife to the Partridge sister, barging in on the door on Eliza R Snow, even throwing Eliza R Snow down the stairs on one account. I don't think any of these historical accounts could be fully verified, but I do think it's fair to say that there was deep animosity between Emma Smith and a lot of the women, especially like the Partridge sisters, because Emma was friends with them, right? She knew them. She felt she could trust them. And then to learn that they were sealed to Joseph Smith, her husband, that was a betrayal to her. At one point, when Emma Smith was the president of the Relief Society, her second counselor, first counselor, and then the secretary were all either married to Joseph Smith or had a daughter married to Joseph Smith. And that was her closest circle of friends in Nauvoo. So you have to imagine how isolating it must have been for Emma as a result of that. And that's why at one point, she made Joseph promise not to take any more wives. At one point, Joseph allowed Emma to burn a revelatory document that supposedly declared polygamy. And then it also explains, I think later on, why Emma Smith denied that polygamy ever took place, because that's about the darkest moment of her life that she could imagine. So it is 6 o'clock. So I imagine lots of you have places to go and you've been bored by me for too long, but thank you so much.
What a public lecture should be. So, how about